September 6, 1779, a Continental Marine captain by the name of Thomas Carnes delivered an incendiary statement to the Massachusetts Council sitting in Boston, and it read, "Gentlemen, being requested to lodge a complaint against Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere for his behavior at Penobscot, which I do in the following manner. First, for disobedience of orders from General Lovell in 2 instances. When ordered to go on shore with 2 18-pounders, 1 12, and 1 4, and 1 howitzer, excused himself. Second, when ordered by Major Todd at the retreat to go with his men and take said cannon from the island, refused, and said his orders were to be under the command of General Lovell during the expedition to Penobscot, and that when the siege was raised, he no longer considered himself under his command. Third, for neglect of duty in several instances. Fourth, for unsoldier-like behavior during the whole expedition to Penobscot, which tends to cowardice. Fifth, for refusing General Wadsworth, the castle barge, to fetch some men on shore from a schooner, which was near the enemy's ships on the retreat up the river. Sixth, for leaving his men and suffering them to disperse and taking no manner of care of them." The Penobscot expedition that took to the seas in the summer of 1779 off the coast of Maine, then a territory of Massachusetts, resulted in the loss of an entire flotilla of 40 American vessels and would be described by a noted Maine historian as a prodigious wreck of property, a dire eclipse of reputation, and universal chagrin. The expedition, wrote another historian, resulted in disaster so complete, so utterly without excuse, and so thoroughly discreditable to American arms as to make its contemplation without feelings of shame and humiliation impossible. What began as a sanguine effort to remove a small British outpost from the coast of Maine would result in a clumsy and mismanaged endeavor and ultimate disaster. It would come to be known quite simply as America's worst naval defeat prior to Pearl Harbor. The role that Paul Revere played in this ill-fated undertaking would become the subject of speculation and controversy for years to come, and would form the catalyst of an infamous and little-known challenge to his character. On the same day that Captain Carnes' complaint was filed, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere, dedicated member of the Sons of Liberty, paladin of Concord and Lexington, active participant in the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere, artisan, activist, and agitator for the revolutionary cause, was summarily relieved of his command at Castle Island and placed under house arrest, his salary and his rations suspended. I want to thank Robert Hayes of the Tewksbury Public Library for inviting me this evening and for allowing me to share with you what I consider to be one of America's most intriguing and yet forgotten stories. It's the story of a complex and often misunderstood personality whose unquestionable patriotism is juxtaposed against a puzzling and obstinate temperament. The back flap of the Court Martial of Paul Revere states that this is my 3rd book. Well, that's not entirely true. I wrote my first book in 1966. I was 9. The name of the book was Mystery on Mars, and it was a wonderful story filled with illustrations and chapters and a wild storyline, and I was tremendously proud of what I had accomplished. I remember looking through the Boston telephone book for publishers, and I recall picking up the phone and calling Little Brown because I liked the way the name sounded. So the woman who answered was very nice, and I told her about my masterpiece, and I asked her if she would be willing to publish it. Well, she told me that if I could type up the manuscript and send it in, that they'd be happy to consider it. Well, convinced that I had just stamped my ticket to stardom, I ran to my mother and I asked her to type up my book so I could submit it to Little Brown. Now, I love my mother dearly. She was a hardworking single parent at the time, and she had a lot on her plate. So, of course, she said no. I was devastated. I had no idea how to type, so that was the end of my dream of authorship. Well, as the years went by, scarred as I was, I finished I finished school, went to college, and I did what most other frustrated and scarred individuals do. I went to law school. And it was there that my interest in writing was rekindled. I can recall in my first year of law school reading an old English case illustrating the crime of larceny, where an individual was tried for stealing a loaf of bread. The professor pointed out that in fact, the crime was punishable by the removal of hands, or was even a capital offense. I began thinking about the people involved and the circumstances that would drive a person to take such a risk. In those days, it was hard enough just trying to figure out those cases without trying to find the great American novel in some abstract rule of law. But I think you will understand my point. I came to believe that behind the cold, sterile facts of every reported case lies a human interest story. And it was then that my desire to reveal these stories took shape. Now, as a practicing lawyer, I'm constantly reminded of the legal cases and the archival materials within which matters of forgotten history often reside. I first learned of Paul Revere's court-martial proceeding in the summer of 2011 while perusing a law review article published in the Boston Bar Journal in 1977, and I was utterly astonished by what I had learned. Why, I wondered, had I never heard of this extraordinary piece of history? Well, as any school child, I learned early on of Revere's historic ride and his pivotal role in the birth of the nation, but his later travails arising from the Penobscot expedition seemed lost to history. Like so many of us living in the Boston area, I gained an affinity for the dramatic events that would lead to the American Revolution, many of which, of course, occurred right here in our own backyard. Local history has always been my passion and has fostered in me an abiding respect for the sons of Massachusetts who nurtured the cause of liberty. As I dug deeper into the biographies and buried archives surrounding the Penobscot expedition, however, a divergent side of Paul Revere began to emerge, and the improbable account of his court-martial unfolded before me. This dichotomy in Revere's personality, this separation between what we think we know about an American icon and what is in fact truth, is what attracted me to the story. The court-martial of Paul Revere is not an unknown piece of history, but it has never been the subject of a full-length book. And most people, I would venture to say, have never heard of it. That is what I find compelling about the topic. The fact that we can still shed light on this man years after his defining moment. And that is what prompted me to write the book. So the story of Paul Revere in popular American culture really begins in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, about 43 years after Revere's death. A New England poet and well-known abolitionist by the name of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, upon a visit to the North Church and Copp's burial ground, found inspiration for his seminal work, Paul Revere's Ride, which was written in order to galvanize the Union cause with a metaphorical call for courage and urgency. The poem was published in the January 1861 issue of the Atlantic magazine, just as South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Prior to Longfellow's poem, Revere had been known locally as a competent goldsmith, a successful entrepreneur, and a dedicated member of the Sons of Liberty. But his midnight ride of April 18th, 1775, had been all but lost to history. Not even his obituary in 1818 made mention of this, his seminal moment according to modern history. Longfellow's poem, which incidentally focused on Revere more for the cadence and rhymability of his name than for actual historical significance, would, however, immediately elevate the name of Paul Revere to iconic and legendary status, a status that perhaps even Revere himself would find puzzling today. In writing the book, I really wanted to provide the reader with a fair and multi-dimensional view of Revere beyond the myths. I'll say that most of the biographies give only passing reference to his actions on the Penobscot expedition and the subsequent legal proceedings against him. An unbiased view of the record, however, reveals what the historical novelist Bernard Cornwell describes as an extraordinary character: belligerent, touchy, capable, awkward, resentful, and unstoppable. And Revere is all of that. There's not a question that he displayed exceptional courage on the night of April 18th and 19th, 1775, when he brought the warning of the British march to Hancock and Adams from Charlestown to Lexington. And it's also pretty indisputable that in later years, he showed himself to be petty and confrontational, and he allowed personality conflicts to interfere with his duty as an officer. Revere was many things, but he was definitely not a soldier. Even Esther Forbes, Revere's chief biographer, noted, "He could learn a new trade as fast as most men turned around, yet his military record is undistinguished. He certainly had no liking for army life." So who was Paul Revere? Most of us think of Longfellow's mythical lone figure on a mighty steed galloping through the moonlit night to Concord, shouting, "The British are coming." But let's weed out some of the myths and inaccuracies that Longfellow and others perpetuated and that have persisted through the years regarding Revere and his ride. First of all, we know that the two lanterns hung in the bell tower of Christ's Church, what we now call the Old North Church, as a signal that the British were on the move, was intended for Paul Revere, was not intended for Paul Revere, as Longfellow implied. It was in fact Revere's message to others. Joseph Warren, the acting head of the provincial government in Boston at the time, had been acutely aware of the British movements in and around the region, and he already knew that the awaited excursion was afoot. He'd maintained contact with an informant, someone very close to top British command, who provided him with confirmation that indeed the Redcoats would march on the evening of April 18th. And their design was in fact to seize Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were known to be at Lexington, and to burn the ammunition and powder stores at Concord. The installed royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, had been extremely tight-lipped about the details of his plan, informing only his trusted subordinate, Lord Percy, and his American-born wife, Margaret Kimball Gage. Now, there is no definitive proof of who Warren's informant was, but we know that Margaret was a rebel sympathizer, and that later that summer, Gage had her unceremoniously shipped back to England, perhaps in the belief that she had betrayed him. So by the time that Revere met with Joseph Warren on the night of April 18th to receive his orders, the men knew when and how the British march would begin. Revere had been concerned that the flow of information out of Boston would be difficult, and so he had earlier agreed with the Patriots of Charlestown that he would provide them with a signal to allow them to act in the event of his capture. After leaving Warren, Revere directed two friends, Robert Newman, who was a sexton at Christ Church, and Captain John Pulling Jr., its vestryman, to hang two lanterns from the church steeple. It was Revere's sign that could be seen clearly across the river in Charlestown that the British were on the move. We also know that Revere was not the only rider that night. Joseph Warren had earlier sent a fellow patriot named William Dawes to Concord via a southern route, over Boston Neck to warn of the British movements. Also, while on the road, Revere met and was joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had been courting his fiancée in Lexington and who volunteered to help spread the alarm. Revere would call him a high son of liberty. In point of fact, Prescott was the only one of the three to actually make it to Concord. Revere was captured by an advance scout of British troops outside of Lexington, and Dawes was knocked off his horse after being pursued and wound up stumbling helplessly through the moonlight, and I might add, into obscurity. But as Revere was held prisoner, the call to arms spread through the countryside, and by the early morning hours, many other riders picked up the mantle and circulated the word throughout Middlesex County and beyond. And let's talk about that word for just a moment. It is very improbable that Revere would have shouted, "The British are coming." They all considered themselves British and loyal subjects of the crown in 1775. It is much more likely that Revere and the others would have warned that the regulars are out, a term used at the time for redcoats or British soldiers. And while we are on the subject of historical accuracy, for those of us who are sticklers for detail, Deacon Larkin's horse that was provided to Revere in Charlestown and that he famously rode north and west to Lexington was not a stallion. She was a mare. Many have noticed that the Revere statue in the north end of Boston is not, shall we say, anatomically correct. I had a history professor in college who would challenge his students to, shall we say, rework the statue in the dead of night with a hammer and chisel. He insisted that they would instantly become the darlings of every women's rights group in the country if they did so. But Paul Revere was really quite heroic on the night of April 18th, 1775, and into the morning hours of the 19th. With assistance of two friends, he crossed the harbor in a rowboat, silently passing the British warship Somerset that had been strategically placed to intercept all such messengers. By 11 p.m., he set out across Charlestown Neck, and in an effort to avoid British patrols to the west, he traveled up Mystic Road through present-day Medford. He crossed a wooden bridge and through North Cambridge to Menotomy, now Arlington. He then rode along the Great Road, which is now Mass Ave, and made his way west toward Lexington. Revere later wrote, "I alarmed every house till I got to Lexington." By midnight, he arrived at the Reverend Jonas Clark House, where John Hancock and Samuel Adams had taken refuge out of Boston. He warned the household of coming danger, and he advised the men to quickly leave Lexington and travel north to avoid capture. Hancock reportedly ran about the house in his silk pajamas and slippers, calling for a sword and musket. But Adams and Revere sternly suggested that the men belonged to the cabinet and that the fight was not theirs. About that time, William Dawes also arrived at the house, and after a short rest, he and Revere continued their trek toward Concord. Now, as I said, Revere was taken prisoner by an advanced British patrol. He never made it to Concord. As the men approached a farmhouse in the village of Lincoln, they found themselves surrounded by an angry patrol of mounted British soldiers. Dr. Prescott, who had joined the men on the Great Road outside of Lexington, spied an opening and signaled to Revere to make a break. Each rider spurred his horse and broke in opposite directions. William Dawes, who was about 200 feet behind, made his own bid for escape. He shouted at the patrol in an effort to divert the soldiers and then bolted down the road to a nearby farmhouse. Now, Prescott, knowing the terrain well, jumped his horse over a stone wall and sprinted hard through the darkness and escaped toward Concord. Revere headed to the right toward a forest at the bottom of the pasture with the idea of leaving his horse and disappearing into the woods by foot. But as he reached the tree line, 6 more British officers appeared on horseback and ordered him to surrender. These soldiers were greatly agitated, and one of them placed his pistol to Revere's head and informed him that he intended to ask some questions, and that if he did not receive truthful answers, he would kill him. I esteemed myself a man of truth, Revere later wrote. He had stopped me on the highway and made me a prisoner. I knew not by what right. I would tell him the truth. I was not afraid. Well, the officers were clearly worried about the prospect of rebel patrols. They searched Revere for arms and ordered him to remount his horse. One officer informed him, "If you attempt to run or we are insulted, we will blow your brains out." The soldiers formed a menacing circle around their prisoner and positioned Revere in front without reins to prevent any thought of escape. They rode briskly toward Lexington, and they abused and harassed Revere as they traveled. One officer informed Revere that he was in a damned critical situation. About half a mile from Lexington Green, the men were startled by the sound of a musket shot in the distance. The commanding officer turned to Revere and angrily demanded an explanation. Revere insisted that it was a signal to alarm the country, and in fact, it may have been. Several moments later, a full barrage of musket fire was heard from the direction of the Lexington meeting house, and the officers became even more alarmed. The musket fire was most likely a simple discharge of weapons by the men of Lexington before entering Buckman's Tavern, when word reached them that the British were still miles away. Revere, however, used the moment to shrewdly inform his captors that 500 rebel troops were assembling against the British incursion. In point of fact, there were about 70 men and boys on Lexington Green. Revere's captors were now determined to warn the approaching British army of any lurking danger of rebel resistance, and they wanted to move quickly. Revere was ordered to dismount and turn his horse over to the soldiers. They then rushed back towards Cambridge, leaving Revere alone on the muddy road. Revere hobbled through the darkness back toward the Jonas Clark house in Lexington. Sometime after 3 o'clock in the morning, he arrived back at the parsonage, dismayed to find the house still in a state of confusion, with Hancock and Adams still arguing amongst themselves about what action to take. Well, as the first faint light of dawn appeared, Revere and John Lowell, Hancock's clerk, finally escorted Adams and Hancock north toward Woburn. Upon journeying with his wards for about 2 miles, Revere was confident that they were safely on their way, and he and John Lowell hurried back to Buckman's Tavern on the Lexington Green to retrieve a trunk owned by Hancock, in which sensitive, incriminating provincial documents had been stored. Meanwhile, the British expedition, slow to start, was now briskly and silently moving toward Lexington. Upon learning of possible rebel resistance, Colonel Francis Smith, the British commander, immediately dispatched 6 companies of light infantry, about 250 men, under the command of Major John Pitcairn, as an advance force to capture the bridges of Concord. As Pitcairn's men approached Lexington Green, Revere and Lowell climbed to an upper floor of Buckman's Tavern where Hancock's trunk rested. As they contemplated how best to remove the chest, Revere glanced out the chamber window into the early dawn and saw the columns of approaching redcoats in the distance. The 2 men painstakingly lowered the heavy trunk down the stairs of the tavern and awkwardly made their way across Lexington Green, where Captain Parker's anxious militiamen stood at the ready. As the 2 men passed, seemingly without notice, through the lines of grim-faced brothers, cousins, fathers, and sons, Revere heard Captain Parker sternly instruct his heavily outnumbered men, "Let the troops pass by and don't molest them without they being first." Major Pitcairn heard the rallying cadence of the Lexington drums as he approached the green with his men, and correctly regarded it as a provocative call to arms. He ordered his regulars to halt the march, prime and load their muskets, then charge at the double quick toward the green. As the regulars approached, a British officer most probably Pitcairn, galloped forward with his pistol in his hand and reportedly demanded that the rebels disperse. Captain Parker, in fact, ordered his men to withdraw, and in doing so, a rush of confusion ensued. Paul Revere was making his way across Lexington Green, laboring hard with Hancock's trunk, when he heard the sound of a gun firing. He turned back and saw a pall of gray smoke in front of the regulars. He later wrote, "They immediately gave a great shout, ran a few paces, and then the whole fired." Despite the musket fire, Paul Revere hurried away, lugging Hancock's trunk into the nearby woods. According even to Esther Forbes, he continued this task, and I quote, "with that simple absorption in what was to be done at the moment which characterizes the whole man. Embattled farmers might stand, and shots fired that would be heard round the world. He gave them one glance and went on with his job." So history reveals a very complex and difficult to discern personality. Revere is not known to have ever kept a journal or personal diary, and his letters are fairly sparse. What emerges is this wide dichotomy of views driven by various histories and primary sources. We know that Revere was first and foremost an entrepreneur who incidentally even charged his own mother rent for lodging. He was a skilled goldsmith and copperplate engraver whose work is still admired in museums and private collections. He was employed by the colony to engrave plates for the printing of currency. And though he wasn't always on good terms with those in political power, he crafted the first seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts following adoption of the state constitution. Few know that Paul Revere was also a dentist. He bragged in published advertisements that he could repair teeth as well as any London surgeon. And in what was perhaps the first use of forensic science, it was Revere who identified the body of his friend, Joseph Warren, in a mass grave following his death at Bunker Hill by examining the dental work that he had provided. So after the war, Revere and his son also established a bell and cannon foundry on Foster Street, which is now Causeway Street, in the north end of Boston. Through the years, he would cast no fewer than 60 church bells, some of which are still hanging in New England steeples. And he even supplied the copper bolts and fittings for the USS Constitution. Later in life, Revere would purchase an old iron mill in Canton and convert the site into a thriving sheet copper rolling plant. And in 1802, he would be asked to supply the copper sheets for the dome of the new Massachusetts State House. But Revere was also an ardent patriot, though he had no qualms about performing work for local Tories and loyalists in Boston. His political affiliations were well known. He was not a statesman or an educated gentleman, as the term was used, but because of his Masonic affiliations and broad social circles, he was perhaps the perfect liaison between the working classes and the upper echelon of the Patriot movement. He was an active member of the Sons of Liberty and a gleeful participant in the Boston Tea Party. His work as an engraver was employed on numerous occasions to cast inflammatory plates for use as propaganda, such as his famous and largely inaccurate rendering of the Boston Massacre. What he is perhaps best known for, however, are his numerous rides, and yes, there was more than one. The local committees of correspondence employed Revere on many envoy missions across the region and beyond to deliver news of ongoing political developments. History recalls him as the messenger of the revolution. So how did Paul Revere go from vigilant patriot to the accused in a court-martial proceeding? We all learned in school about his midnight ride, but that's really the extent of what most people know about him. The reality is that Revere's noble public service essentially ends on April 19th, 1775, and his troubles actually begin. Following Lexington, the work began to raise a provincial army, and then, of course, a Continental Army. And the process was fraught with nepotism and bias. And at the time, the stuff of a Continental officer included wealth, education, and status, none of which Revere really possessed. Remember, he was a blue-collar guy. And so it was with a mounting sense of personal frustration that he found himself bypassed in the process and overlooked as a federal officer. Ultimately, Revere was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts artillery train and was stationed at Castle Island in defense of Boston and its harbor. But this sense of being unfairly overlooked for Continental service would dog him for much of his career. So life at the castle, as it was known, was dreary and repetitive and provided little opportunity to distinguish oneself in battle. Revere remained angry and resentful that many of his contemporaries were gaining these prestigious appointments in the Continental Army, but that he had been relegated to local and seemingly inconsequential duty. Nonetheless, he ran a disciplined regiment on the island and drilled his men hard, but over time, he found it difficult to prevent the rampant disorder and desertions that plagued the unit. In time, the artillery regiment was essentially downsized, and many of the officers resigned their commissions, but Revere refused, insisting that the powers in Boston desired him to stay on. Well, right or wrong, his fellow officers began to harbor a growing resentment for what they construed as selfish ambition. And so, as the revolution raged on without him, Revere constantly engaged in battles, not with the enemy, but with his own men. On one occasion, he even ordered the Castle Island cannon to fire on an American warship in an effort to force its captain to relinquish some deserters from the artillery regiment. It would not be long before he gained the reputation as an ill-tempered and confrontational officer. Well, in the midst of this turmoil, the British came back to Massachusetts. They established a presence on the coastline of Maine, again, the territory of Massachusetts, and began recruiting the locals in an effort to fortify the area. With this outpost, it was hoped that the abundant timber of northern New England could be denied to Yankee shipbuilders and that a buffer could be created to protect Nova Scotia and southern Canada from rebel attack. The settlement, to be called New Ireland, would also, it was hoped, provide Loyalist refugees with a peaceful new homeland. Well, the response in Boston was a massive military undertaking, the so-called Penobscot Expedition. Every available warship and transport in and around the ports of Massachusetts were either volunteered or impressed into service in the endeavor. By mid-June of 1779, the largest naval armada of the American Revolution had been amassed, and confidence ran high. As part of the land component of the expedition, Paul Revere finally received the orders that he hoped would lead him from military obscurity. He was to lead the Massachusetts Artillery Regiment into battle in the state's effort to dislodge the British from Maine. What could possibly go wrong? Well, from here, the story sort of degenerates into a melee of finger pointing and accusations. The Penobscot expedition was plagued from the start with mismanagement and timid leaders and was doomed to failure. Dudley Saltonstall, the Commodore of the American Naval Force, refused to attack the 3 small British sloops that guarded the harbor until the land forces attacked the British fort. And the land forces, once they gained a position on the heights outside of the fort, refused to press the attack until the British ships were destroyed. And so for the better part of a month, precious little was accomplished by either side until, of course, a flotilla of British reinforcements arrived and forced the entire rebel force to retreat in panic. Well, even before Paul Revere got back to Boston, stories of his conduct began during the Penobscot expedition circulated around the town and it would not be long before a formal complaint was drawn against him. In the failure of Penobscot, Revere's enemies finally had a foothold of attack. Massachusetts quickly convened a court of inquiry at Faneuil Hall to determine the causes of the failed expedition. And as part of the inquest, a series of written statements were taken of virtually all of the officers who served, each of which was read aloud and accepted as evidence. Now, the record of this inquiry is really quite intriguing and became one of the most important primary sources for the book. One of the difficult tasks, I will say, as a nonfiction writer is to distinguish truth from falsehood. But in this case, the accusations themselves are part of the record and really shape the story. It's very interesting how similarly situated people can view the same event through the prism of their own biases and personal prejudices and arrive at completely different conclusions. This is true of nearly every legal battle, and it was true of the case against Paul Revere. It was in these sworn statements that the detailed allegations against Revere took formal shape. Now, Paul Revere was extremely independent and unaccustomed to following orders. The record reveals that he was legalistic in his interpretation of rules. He was often combative in the many councils of war that were held to determine strategy. During the initial assault on the heights surrounding the British stronghold, he was accused of lagging far to the rear. And then after the rebel land forces achieved their initial objectives, he came back down to the shore and came aboard one of the ships for breakfast before working with his men to bring up the artillery, as he was ordered to immediately do. In fact, Revere was seen on various occasions retiring to the ship for meals while his men labored on the cliffs, and he was accused of actually sleeping on board while all hands had been ordered to remain on shore. Solomon Lovell, the commanding officer of the rebel ground forces, angrily commented on several occasions that Paul Revere, his artillery commander, was nowhere to be found. Others commented on his lack of artillery skill and leadership, and even the leader of the British forces suggested that the rebel cannon fire controlled by Revere was laughably ineffective. Well, as the Penobscot expedition degenerated into failure, Revere was given orders by General Lovell to remove certain cannon from an island to be used in a defensive stand against the British reinforcements. Well, instead of following the order, Revere was seen removing his council orders from his pocket and studying them. He was heard to say that since he was mandated by the state to be under the general's command during the Penobscot expedition, and since for all practical purposes the expedition had in his mind ended, he no longer considered himself bound by the general's orders, and he refused them. And in a stroke of historic irony, another of Revere's commanding officers, General Peleg Wadsworth, the grandfather of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, promised Revere's immediate arrest for contravention of his orders in the rescue of a disabled schooner during the upriver retreat of rebel forces. Wadsworth commanded the use of Revere's Castle Island barge in the rescue effort, but Revere refused the order, stating that he had all of his private baggage on the craft and asked who would thank him for losing that in attempting to save the schooner to the state. Not exactly the Paul Revere that we learned about as children. So the expedition officers, as they gallantly regrouped and attempted to make one final stand against the British to salvage the mission, Paul Revere and many others concluded that they were no longer needed, and they left for home. General Lovell asked the Massachusetts Council to reprimand his artillery commander for leaving without orders. Well, back in Boston, Revere had become the subject of rampant gossip, and public clamor had turned decidedly against him. As I said, he was immediately stripped of his command of Castle Island and temporarily placed under house arrest. He complained bitterly to his friends and fellow soldiers that he had been falsely and unfairly accused and he resolved to fight the charges with every ounce of his energy. He fired off angry and expressive letters and petitions to the Massachusetts Council, protesting his innocence and declaring the existence of some vast conspiracy to besmirch his character. He insisted that because of the problems he had faced earlier with his men on Castle Island, a group of officers had plotted against him and lied about his conduct on the Penobscot expedition. It lays with you in great measure, he begged the committee, to determine what is more dear to me than my life, my character. And he spoke of the complaint against him as an everlasting monument of disgrace, which would remain until proven false. Well, to Revere's utter dismay, the state's inquiry into the causes of the Penobscot expedition failed to either condemn or exonerate him. In fact, the report completely ignored him, despite the volumes of testimony for and against him adduced at the hearings. Well, predictably, this infuriated Revere. He viewed the allegations as an unfounded and scurrilous assault on his character, and he demanded to be heard on the subject. Badgering his political allies for a specific hearing into his involvement at Penobscot, he did finally obtain an inquiry, only to be disappointed with the committee finding that his actions were, quote, not wholly justifiable. Well, most in Boston believed that Revere had gotten just what he deserved. He had asked for a hearing, and the committee ruled against him. But instead of letting the matter die, he worked harder than ever to find a tribunal to rehear his case. Well, for the next 3 years, as Massachusetts moved on from the failures of the Penobscot expedition and set out to form a new and pioneering state constitution, Revere remained single-minded and nearly obsessive in his quest to clear his name. He repeatedly demanded a trial by court-martial, and most people resented him for it. Petition after petition was filed and either ignored or scorned, but Revere never faltered in his resolve. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere of the Massachusetts Corps of Artillery finally got his court-martial, but it wasn't until 1783. He had long since returned to business, and the people of Boston had relegated the Penobscot fiasco to the unchangeable past. Governor John Hancock, the man who Paul Revere had come to warn, on that moonlit night in 1775, appointed a president and a panel of 12 legal and military minds to mull over the evidence and pass judgment on the character of Paul Revere. Now, I'm not going to tell you the findings of the court-martial because I know you'll all be buying the book and finding out for yourself, but I will tell you that following the ruling, a vicious and quite public war of words played out between Revere and his enemies in the Boston newspapers. I should be very happy. I should be very sorry, wrote Revere's chief accuser, to put my character on a footing with Paul Revere, who the world knows to be a coward. Well, the Penobscot expedition and Paul Revere's role in it would be forgotten. But in 1860, of course, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow would propel Revere to enduring fame. I think perhaps Revere's contemporaries might roll over in their graves if they knew how the man might be thought of or would be thought of in popular culture. But frankly, I don't think Revere himself would even slightly object. I thank you all for your time and your attention. Mr. Hayes, if there are any questions.
Great. Yeah, I was muted there, Mike. Sorry. So thank you, Michael, so much. Wonderful job. And we heard that 7:40 train run past your window there. So I want to open it up to questions. So if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to type them into the chat. Also, you can raise your virtual hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question via video or audio. So we have multiple options here. Did anyone have any questions for Michael? He just gave a great 45-minute presentation. What do we think?
Going to be an early night for Michael then.
A couple people might be typing, it looks like, but I don't know if it's typing into the chat or typing something else. Oh, Ginny, do you have a question? All right, Ginny, I'm going to ask you, you have to unmute yourself, Ginny, okay? Go ahead.
Got it?
Got it. Yep.
No, I don't have a question, but I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. This was good. This was a very, very good. Very, very good. Thank you.
Okay.
No questions. I'll have to maybe read the book to find out what's going on, but I mean, no, this is very good. This is superlative. Thank you so much, Michael Greenberg. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ginny. That's very nice of you to say.
We'll take the compliment. Mike will take the compliment.
Oh.
Judith says thank you in the chat. Nancy wants to know, have you been to Battle Road's site of Paul Revere's capture?
Yes, I have. Very interesting place. And, you know, we're really fortunate to be living in an area where we can just jump into our car and head down the road and be amidst all this history. This is a place where, you know, these things happened, and I think there are a lot of good preservation movements, and you know, these sites are as I said, pretty well preserved. We're very lucky.
Rick Salemi wants to ask a video question. So Rick, you have to unmute on your end and you'll be good to go.
Got it. Thank you, Rob. It's easier for me to ask this way because I'm on an iPad and typing is kind of a pain.
Sure.
My question is actually about that same site that's down on 2A just outside of Hanscom. I don't know if it's in the actual location of where he was captured. Part of the history I hear is that he was actually captured somewhere on the base, on base housing. Other people say, no, it's really close. And you can never get a clear answer from the guys at Minuteman Park or down at Buckman Tavern. I don't think they even know. So I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yeah, it's probably because we don't really know. Most of what is known about that evening, at least insofar as it deals with Paul Revere, was written by Paul Revere. There are 3 depositions in the Massachusetts Historical Society where his account is set forth, and he talks about the area, and I think I described it pretty much in my talk as he described it in his depositions. Beyond that, you know, the area and not necessarily the topography, but certainly the vegetation and the trees, it changes. So I think the exact locations of these things are difficult to know, but I think Park Service and certainly historians other than myself might have a better understanding of exactly where these things took place. But my guess is if you've already inquired of some of the tour guides and rangers, and if they don't know, I'm guessing the actual site of these things is not known. The plaque is there, and we know it was in the general area. So it's about all I can add to it.
Christy has a question. Did you say that Longfellow was related to Paul Revere? You said something about Longfellow and I missed it. What did you say about Longfellow?
I said that Peleg Wadsworth, Longfellow's grandfather, was one of Paul Revere's commanding officers. And the irony is that the man who would turn Revere's name into an icon, that man's grandfather promised Paul Revere's arrest from because of his actions on the Penobscot expedition. Very interesting.
We'll take a few more minutes of questions. Lauren wants to know, I heard that Revere once beat a horse to death in or near the Boston Common. Did this really happen? He seems to have had quite a temper.
Well, certainly he had a temper and he was obstinate. And there's a great study called Paul Revere's Ride, written by David Hackett. And that is the authoritative work on Paul Revere. And if you wanted to learn that kind of detail about Revere and his character, and the book goes into weather patterns and things that might have affected the ride that night. I read it. I do not recall that story. I read a lot about Paul Revere in researching this book, but I do not recall that story, though it wouldn't surprise me.
All right, so we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I don't see any additional questions in the chat. Let's do this. Michael, do you have any last words or anything you want to leave the group with?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me. I think you have a wonderful program, and in these uncertain times, it's really commendable that we have these kinds of outlets, and I'm very pleased and honored to be part of your program, Robert.
I appreciate that, Michael. We're honored to have you. So folks, tomorrow morning, probably around 8 o'clock, you should get an email from me. Please take that feedback survey, greatly appreciated. Tomorrow night, I didn't really talk about this. Tomorrow night, we have a talk on Medusa and Greek mythology. And then Thursday night, we have the Ghost Army of World War II. So hopefully you can make one of those two programs if you're interested and available. Well, let's face it, we're all just about available. But if you're interested, hopefully you can make that. So all 30 of us or so, let's give a big round of applause to Michael for joining us here tonight. Thank you so much, Michael. You did a great job. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Thank you all. Everyone have a great night.
Good night.